Hello and welcome all English-speaking entire auditory to this video review of Ukrainian battlefield as of June the 2nd. My name is Vasil Tekno and I'm a Ukrainian journalist who is observing Ukrainian front already for more than 3 years. And I propose you the fresh view, the live update, what is going on Ukrainian battlefield. And about the most important events we'll be talking right now, but also about an incredible and historic event which took place yesterday. It was the strike on Russian strategic aviation aircraft and airfields. So it was 41 strategic aircraft which reportedly were hit, and I will tell you about all the details, how it became realistic one, and I'm really sure that this event will be studied in historic books later. I'll tell you about how our first-person view drones made this historic strike. So let's begin. Just take a look at this photo. I don't think I've ever seen the head of the security service of Ukraine, Vasil Vasilovich Malyuk, look this satisfied. Usually this man is rather gloomy in his demeanor, but today, or rather yesterday, he was practically radiating what you would call joy and utmost satisfaction. There are plenty of reasons for this. Roughly 41 reasons to be exact, because it was precisely 41 strategic aviation aircraft that, as a result of yesterday's attack by the armed forces of Ukraine, or more accurately, not just the armed forces, but in a broader sense, we should talk about the defense forces of our country and specifically the security service of Ukraine, need to be mentioned since yesterday, for the first time probably in the entire history of the war, FPV drones, short-range drones managed to inflict damage on airfields housing strategic aviation. Russian strategic aviation airfields had not previously suffered any strikes, and yesterday the security service of Ukraine officially confirmed that 34% of Russian strategic bombers were lost. And do you know what the most important thing in this situation is? It's not even about counting the losses in monetary terms, because yesterday the SBU press service said that the losses suffered by the Russians are estimated at around $7 billion. It's not even about the money. The point is that Russian strategic aviation, these are the Tu-22M3, Tu-95MS, and Tu-160 aircraft. All of these planes were built back in the Soviet Union era. They are irreplaceable. Russia does not currently have the capability to restore them. Russia also does not have the capability to build new ones now. They might theoretically be able to repair some of them, but creating new ones is an impossible task for the current Russian Federation. In other words, they would have to develop something new. They don't have anything new, all they have are remnants from the Soviet Union. Accordingly, based on this, we need to take into account what Russia has lost irretrievably. That is 34% of the strategic aviation of the Russian Federation. Here is another photo. It is also of historical significance, showing Vasil Vasilovich Malyuk, the head of the security service of Ukraine, planning an operation called Web. I am convinced that our children and grandchildren will study it. Future generations of Ukrainians will definitely study it in textbooks, because Operation Web included an attack on 5 Russian airfields with strategic aviation. These are the airfields of Balaya, Dyagilevo, Olenya, Voskresensk, and Ivanovo. More than 40 aircraft, according to preliminary data, were hit, and the destruction of almost 8 Russian strategic aviation aircraft has been definitively confirmed by the available satellite images. 1 year, 6 months, and 9 days. That is exactly how long the planning of this operation took, from the very beginning of its planning to its successful execution. And most importantly, all the agents who carried out this task managed to leave Russian territory in time. So this is a story, an incredible story of how it all happened. Now let's talk about the methodology, how the security service of Ukraine accomplished this. I understand that it's obviously possible to talk about this now because the SBU probably doesn't expect to pull off such a trick a second time, This is just a phenomenal story. So how did it all begin? It all started with the Security Service of Ukraine renting a warehouse in the Chelyabinsk region, to be precise. And in this warehouse, they set up these modular houses that they began selling across the territory of the Russian Federation. And these modular houses were delivered by designated trucks. But these modular houses had one special feature. FPV drones were hidden under their roofs in this way. FPV drones that at the right time and in the right place, when the truck stopped near the strategic aviation airfields, the roofs opened and the FPV drones took off from these platforms, from these modular houses. As a result, 116 drones struck the Russian strategic assets right at their bases. That is, this includes the Olenya airfield, which is 1,800 kilometers from our border between Ukraine and the Russian Federation, 1,800 kilometers. In order for a long-range drone to cover such a distance, it takes, well, honestly, to some extent, you even need a bit of luck to make it so that none of the Russian surface-to-air missile systems detect and shoot it down. But an FPV drone, a tiny drone, most likely assembled on the territory of the Russian Federation, with elements of artificial intelligence, as our Western friends and partners have noted in their media, mentioning that it was specifically artificial intelligence components that were embedded in these drones, allowing them to recognize Russian strategic bombers. These drones began to strike Russian airfields. The airfield that suffered the most was Olenya in the Murmansk region, because a large number of Russian strategic bombers were based there. Just the Tu-160s alone, about 40 of them. And you can see how they were burning. In some cases, the drones targeted the fuel compartment, in others, the wing, and in others, still the engine, so to speak. These strikes were delivered in this way. In fact, I'll repeat myself. There's no point in discussing the economics of inflicting damage on this enemy strategic aviation because the Tu-95, Tu-160, and Tu-22 aircraft are no longer being produced. Each aircraft is priceless. And you know what's most interesting? Even the symbolism of carrying out this operation is significant because exactly 29 years ago, on June 1st, 1996, Ukraine handed over its strategic bombers to the Russians as part of nuclear disarmament. Every operation has a special, hidden subtext. This is one of those hidden subtexts. 29 years ago, on June 1st, 1996, Ukraine handed over its strategic aviation aircraft to the Russians under the Budapest Memorandum as part of Ukraine's nuclear disarmament. And 29 years later, Ukraine takes away part of Russia's nuclear triad. In reality, this is an incredible expansion of the red lines, the red zones, which shows that Ukraine is in no way afraid of what Russia has. It is not afraid of their special forces, not afraid of their over-the-horizon radar stations, not afraid of their bombers, and it carries out such extremely daring operations. So what does Russia have now as a result? A loss of 34% in just one day. Just imagine how much that is. More than a third of Russia's strategic bombers, which cannot be replaced. They are essentially lost. There is panic in Russia. This panic consists in the fact that now the Russian police are checking absolutely all trucks, inspecting them for things like modular houses, strike FPV drones, and similar items. Collapse. Inspection. All of this is happening against the backdrop of the Istanbul negotiations, where Ukraine is being forced to capitulate. This actually significantly strengthens our position. These are essentially the cards in hand that Trump has talked about at length. The Russian, or even more specifically, the so-called Zid blogger community, is devastated. Russian society is truly feeling the full the significance of what has happened, because many Russian bloggers have called June 1st a black day for Russian aviation. Some are even calling it, for example, the Russian Pearl Harbor. Others say that this is worse than the loss of the Black Sea Fleet flagship, the cruiser Moskva. That's why demoralization is a very important factor in winning wars. Although, friends, let the undoubtedly joyful day remain in the past as yesterday. We will rejoice, but then we will also talk about sad things, among other topics. Because on that very day, during the night of May 31st to June 1st, the Russians launched the most massive Shahed and missile strike on the territory of Ukraine, primarily using Shaheds. Almost 500 drones were directed both at our locations, including those where our aviation is based, as well as at locations with training centers. And the incident that occurred in the Dnipropetrovsk region at the 296th Training Center, 12 people killed as a result of an enemy missile strike and more than 60 wounded. All of this resulted in the commander of the ground forces of the armed forces of Ukraine, Lieutenant General, if I'm not mistaken, Drapatin, though the rank isn't what matters here, it's the actions, Mikhailo Vasilovich Drapatin submitting his resignation. He wrote a statement saying, in essence, I request to be relieved of my position as commander of the ground forces because I feel responsible for not having done enough to ensure the safety of our soldiers who are at the training centers. This is not the first time that training centers have been targeted, and Drapatin wrote the following. Let me briefly quote him. This is a conscious step, dictated by my personal sense of responsibility for the tragedy at the 239th Training Ground, as a result of which our soldiers were killed. In fact, I really hope that the Commander-in-Chief will not accept this resignation. On the contrary, Drapatin will continue his military career as an officer who demonstrates a willingness to sacrifice himself, his ranks, his position, for the sake of the mission assigned to him and his subordinates. Because it is very rare in Ukrainian history to see such actions from generals and such deeds as Drapatin has done, he resigned. This is a completely civilized approach. But I absolutely do not see any objection from the soldiers to Drapatin being the one who resigns. Yes, we still have a lot of such screw-ups, if we can call them that. Screw-ups, tragic screw-ups with the preparation of people, with the mass gatherings of people. But the fact that the commander of the ground forces feels his responsibility for this, and he genuinely acknowledges that someone must ultimately be held accountable, and he is ready to be the one to do it. Well, in reality, that actually means a great deal. That's why I hope that, on the contrary, the president will keep Drapatin in his position. On the contrary, Drapatin will continue to advance in his career in the future, because we need generals like him, especially since under Drapatin's leadership, many things at the front have improved. Things have improved ultimately, considering that the Russians are currently attacking the front lines with extraordinary intensity. As for the results of May, yesterday we actually had the opportunity to sum them up. So according to the results for May, if we compare it to April, the enemy increased the intensity of combat engagements by about 1/5, by 19%. If in April, on average, the Russians carried out 155 attacks per day, then during May this number was already 184 attacks. Just think about it, 184 attacks. Against the backdrop of the negotiation process, this hardly seems or appears to be actions that indicate our enemy is ready to negotiate about anything at all. 184 attacks every day. Accordingly, most of these attacks, up to a third, are directed at the Pokrovsk direction. And now, as I move on to reviewing the map of the actual combat operations, I will continue to assert, this is my subjective opinion, that the Donetsk-Pokrovsk front remains the #1 priority for the occupiers in their summer offensive. Although, by the way, the summer offensive began in an unexpectedly interesting way, in the sense that it was Ukraine that delivered deep and very painful strikes on Russian territory, not the Russians. Therefore, the Donetsk direction is #1, but undoubtedly we have certain changes and certain things happening on both the northern and even the southern fronts, which we will discuss next. So the northern front, Sumy region first of all, recently, even on deep state, the occupation and the advance toward the settlement of Volodymyrivka have been reflected. Here we can see the secured territory. Moreover, I can say that I have information about the presence of the enemy in the settlement of Kindrativka. This is in the Khotin direction, in the Sumy region. But the most important thing here, I believe and continue to insist, is that this is not a catastrophe, because in the Sumy region, based on my experience talking with the soldiers, I know that there are good defensive lines in Sumy, really very good ones. They are well constructed, and everything that the Russians are capturing now is just a kind of gray area, a no man's land, which has only now reached essentially the first obstacles that the Russians have run into. Furthermore, again, even if you look at the map, there are opinions, and they are quite reasonable. These opinions are based on the idea that the Russians cannot advance too far. Because even if we look at the direction of that same Lochnia, where the deepest advance is, which amounts to 10 kilometers into the territory of our country, then 10 kilometers is to some extent the maximum. Well, maybe they can push a little further, but overall, the Russians now face the need to expand their flanks, meaning they have to move west and east in order to widen their border control zone. Because further advancing, for example, another 15 to 20 kilometers, is something they absolutely will not and cannot do. Why? There is a completely clear logic here, because every additional kilometer of such an advance puts their flanks at risk, and accordingly, these flanks need to be secured and expanded. To expand means to use more resources, not just along a single narrow direction, but across a much broader front. Accordingly, this means that the group of troops they have assembled in the Sumy direction, about 60,000 personnel, will have to be spread out along the front. Spreading them out along the front means that the depth of their advance will not be particularly significant. Accordingly, what we are observing now is very likely a sign, perhaps the absolute maximum, if you'll pardon the tautology, of what the Russians are currently capable of doing in the Sumy direction. But undoubtedly, this was primarily their informational attack. Now, I think that with our SBU strike, we have disrupted their informational attack on the Sumy region. This is what is happening now in the northern direction. In addition, it is worth noting that yesterday a number of events took place in the northern direction, which, among other things, contributed to the deterioration of the Russian Federation's logistics, not only in the Sumy region, but generally along our entire northern front. Well, I won't say anything more here. It seems to me that it's quite a coincidence that a number of railway bridges and road bridges, well, it just so happened that they exploded in the Russian border regions of Bryansk and Kursk. Somewhere they just lay down, somewhere they got tired, somewhere they broke. Somehow it just happened that way, and in fact it really works in our favor. Let's go through things chronologically to figure out what exactly happened and how. Number one, last night, from May 31 to June 1st, the first bridge in Bryansk region laid down. It collapsed. Both the road and the passenger bridges were damaged. Well, actually both, because they ran next to each other and they both collapsed. I have a suspicion that this happened simply because the bridge was overloaded, but the Russians will undoubtedly look for a Ukrainian trace in this. As a result, 7 Russians were killed and 71 people were injured. This happened at around 23 Mars on May 31st. At around 3 in the morning, already on June 1st, in the city of Zheleznogorsk in the Kursk region, a bridge collapsed in the same way, a railway bridge in Zheleznogorsk. Here we can see how the Russian railways went down there. In fact, due to the collapse of the bridge structure, the train that was just passing fell onto the highway. As a result, there was a complete collapse, and it was necessary to painstakingly clear all the debris. The third episode, which also took place in the Bryansk region, is already showing a map of the section between Unecha and Rzecha. These are 2 settlements. There as well, a track measurement train was literally passing by, and there was an explosion or some kind of damage to the railway track. So what exactly was it? Well, it's hard to say, but in any case, it slowed down the movement. Accordingly, we can see this wonderful infographic from the Telegram channel Oko Hora. By the way, I also encourage you, friends, to subscribe to my Telegram channel, my personal Telegram blog, Paino, which I run myself. You can find the link to it in the description of this video. or like this, as you see on the screen, @Pino_news. You can search for it in the search bar of this social network and subscribe to me. There, we'll talk not only about explosions, not only about the flights of our FPV drones, but also about frontline analysis. So I invite you to join. So returning to this information from the Telegram channel Okohora, what do we see? Basically, there are two railway lines. One of them leads from Oryol towards Glushkovo, Korenyevo, that's the Kursk region, and the other leads from Bryansk to our border area. They have stalled, they've come to a halt as a result of these explosions. Why? Because these accidents happened, these unpredictable emergencies occurred on the Ukrainian border in the Bryansk and Kursk regions. Who contributed to this? Honestly, I have no idea. Maybe it's just a really fortunate coincidence for us that the logistics of the Russian troops in the northern direction have been seriously disrupted. Rumor has it that yesterday, even the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio called the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, and Lavrov complained bitterly, lamenting what happened here on the tracks, and supposedly Rubio even expressed his sympathy for the Russian losses. Well, things like that happen. That's what happens when you go to war against another country. Karma, perhaps, catches up with you and leads to these kinds of unpredictable situations. Interestingly, the predictable strikes on the railway tracks occurred in the south of our country. That's our country now, not Russia's, but our country. Specifically, we're talking about the fact that yesterday, the main intelligence directorate reported a strike in Yakimivka, targeting a freight train that was being used by Russian occupiers to move around. Here is Yakimivka, which is south of Melitopol. As you can see, it runs along a single rail line that leads from the occupied territory of Zaporizhzhia to the occupied territory of Crimea. A strike took place here. Another strike occurred, which was reported by fighters from the Airbase movement, our partisans who operate in the occupied territories. So they were talking about this section. Let me highlight it more clearly. This section marked in yellow on the deep state map. This is the railway line connecting Rostov and Mariupol, the so-called Volnovakha railway, where a strike also took place. There is even a photo confirming this strike. What is it exactly? It is the disabling of the occupiers' railway section by destroying the signaling and train traffic control system on the Taganrog, Mariupol-Rostov Taganrog Mariupol line. This line, as is known, was once originally established to provide and secure logistics for the South, in particular bypassing the Crimean Bridge. So what do we see as a result? It so happened, well, I guess we were lucky, that in the north, in the Bryansk and Kursk regions, the enemy's logistics have been disrupted. And in the south, in the Zaporizhzhia and Donetsk regions, the enemy's logistics have also been disrupted. And this is despite the fact that, by the way, just over the weekend, Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi reported that the enemy had become more active in the Zaporizhzhia direction, particularly towards Kamyanske and Holubkove, that's closer to the Dnipro River, in the direction of Zaporizhzhia. The enemy has become a bit more active. Accordingly, we can conclude that our intelligence is perfectly aware of the Russians' logistical capabilities and activities. Moreover, I expect a series of further surprises, very unpleasant ones for the Russians, on the territory of the Russian Federation, which could happen in the coming, let's say, days. But at the same time, neither the North nor the South, as I have always emphasized, are the number one target of the enemy occupation forces, if we are talking about the summer offensive right now. Still, the number one targets are Kostiantynivka and Pokrovsk, that is, the two directions of the Donetsk bridgehead, which the Russians are now trying to split along the directions of Mirnohrad, Pokrovsk, and Kostiantynivka. In fact, right now, the Russians, are moving with the goal of splitting our bridgeheads like this, isolating them from each other, and trying to fully capture these two agglomerations during the upcoming summer campaign, which they are already carrying out. If we look at how things are going for us there, honestly speaking, things aren't going very well. Because in the direction of that same Mirnohrad, in fact, Malinivka is no longer under our control. Malinivka, for example, is not controlled by the Ukrainian Defense Forces, just as Mirolibivka is also not controlled by the Ukrainian Defense Forces. And now the enemy is essentially closing off this pocket between these two settlements, including Yelizavetivka, where they are also making gains. That's if we're talking about the Mirnohrad direction. Although it's worth noting here that we have a wonderful settlement called Novoekonomikne, which, given the right and well-organized defense, has every chance of becoming an impregnable fortress for the occupiers in this Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad direction. This is one side of the Pokrovsk-Toretsk-Kostiantynivka agglomeration. On the other side, we see the Russians advancing further toward Popovy Yar from Novolenivka in the direction of Kostiantynivka. And there are also further advances in the Zorya Romanivka direction toward Yablunivka. Here, unfortunately, the enemy is also trying to cut off this salient, although it is much larger than the one in the direction of Malinivka and Mirolyubivka, Yelizavetivka. Here they are trying to cut off the Toretsk direction, but for now they are only able to close this Toretsk pocket with a kind of dashed line. However, for now, they are not capable of doing this because we have a rather solid line of defense here. And to sum up, but I'll repeat once again, the main focus is the Donetsk direction. The second goal, the second objective of the Russian summer campaign may very well be, and probably will be, Kupiansk. That's why in the Kharkiv and northern Kharkiv directions, we are seeing a series of events related to increased enemy activity. I reported this as early as last week. This has essentially been confirmed with the start of the new week. So friends, we'll continue to monitor the battle map for you in the most accessible and prompt live update mode possible. To stay updated on all these developments, I'll ask you to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and of course, leave your comments below or in the chat for this video. Thank you for your attention. Take care of yourselves, friends. All the best and see you next time.